Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest today, Mr. Cade Benfield, Senior Counsel at Placemakers and author of People Habitat, 25 Ways to Think About Greener, Healthier Cities. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Brad, and thanks for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure, and I hope that it's not too dismal up in the D.C. area today.
Well, the sun is shining, and it's a crisp fall day, so at least we've got that going for us.
Very good, very good. Well, I wonder if we could kind of start by you telling us a little bit about your work and where you think you fit kind of in the broader work of creating great cities or better places.
Well, I am fortunate enough at this point in my career to be wearing several hats. One is, as you mentioned, I'm an advisor to Placemakers, which is a small planning and development advisory group that works with municipalities all across the country and a little bit in Canada for that matter. I also teach law and policy for sustainable communities at George Washington University Law School, and I am on the board of Smart Growth America and very involved in that organization's work on behalf of better communities. And if I have a particular perspective that I bring to these roles, one is environmental. I had a long history in the environmental movement, and I tend to think about what the research teaches us about communities in terms of the environment and what makes them work both for people and for the planet at the same time. If our solutions don't work for people, they're never going to work for the planet. So I think it's really important that we keep both of those goals in mind. And then maybe the other thing I bring is my legal perspective. I was a practicing lawyer for many years, including on behalf of environmental clients. And that means I tend to think of a certain way about issues and how they fit within the greater scheme of society from a legal perspective. And hopefully I bring those 2 points of view to the broader discussion of the wonderful world of placemaking, which is a very exciting world these days.
Indeed it is, ever-changing and even harder to find every day than it was the day before, it seems. But I wonder kind of, Vernice came and spoke at CityWorks Expo a couple of years ago, and she, I think, got a good reaction from the crowd when she talked about she loves the idea of saving the whales, but can't we focus on the people first? And I wonder kind of how you deal with these complexities in the environmental movement between those that want to look at the people side of things and those that are more focused on I guess the natural side of things, for lack of a better phrase.
Well, I think we have to do both. One of the things that I believe very strongly is that we both need nature in our cities, and that we also need cities to help protect nature. The more we stay in cities, the less we trample on nature, but at the same time, we humans are biophilic creatures, meaning that we're hardwired to love living nature, and we need to have that around us for our cities to work and to be beautiful and to be functional. So I tend not to separate those two words. I think that our our task is to make them work together.
Did you kind of get into that city side of things from that idea that density is better for the environmental side of things?
I first got interested in, well, let me back up a little bit. I think even as a child, I was very interested in cities. I grew up in a small city in North Carolina, and even as a little kid, I loved being downtown, and I loved the idea of bigger, more exciting cities. But my environmental career started out not having much to do with cities. In fact, I was head of the forestry program for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I basically litigated a lot of cases pertaining to the management of our national forests. And at one point, I felt like I didn't really want to keep litigating without working on solutions in a positive way. And the first opportunity I had to do that at NRDC was to work on transportation. And it took me about a day to figure out that in order to have more environmentally efficient transportation, we had to have more efficient land use. And I think that was really the starting point. And then from there, I started teaching myself about ways in which we can have those more efficient elements of land use in our cities and our suburbs, for that matter.
I noticed looking through some of your literature and stuff that you use sustainability language a lot, which is obviously not surprising in this realm. But I wonder if if you think about sustainable cities and stuff, does that include the sustainable development side in terms of including the equity and the stuff, or how do you kind of make all of that work together when you're thinking about how places work?
Well, just because of my training and experience, my starting point is always environmental. But I think it's tremendously important that we work in terms of an equitable and just society. That's part of making communities that work for people is making them equitable and just. And they also have to work in an economic sense. If cities aren't functioning well economically, then chances are they're going to have more challenges functioning equitably and environmentally. So I guess traditionally the three-legged stool, as some people call it, that supports sustainability is people, planet, and prosperity, or equity, environment, and economy. And I do think that if we fail at any one of those things, then the other two are likely to become much more challenging for us as well.
Do you think that there's a opportunity right now that there seems to be a lot of momentum? The idea of smart growth seems to continue to grow in many fields, and sustainability seems to become normalized in many communities. Do you see a momentum and an opportunity for cities in particular to kind of lead this discussion?
Absolutely. In fact, it may be more important now for cities to lead the discussion in the United States, at least, than at any time in the last several decades, as the federal government seems to be unable or unwilling to do as much for sustainability as we really need our national government to do. I think that the leadership role falls to cities, and I think it falls to cities at a pretty exciting time for cities. 20 or 30 years ago, nobody was talking about this stuff in the way that you and I have begun talking about it today. And it's been really exciting to see cities change from a place that people wanted to avoid and a place that was thought of only as a source of environmental problems to where now we think of cities in terms of environmental solutions, and they're growing. Some 85% of us in America now live in cities and nearby suburbs, and that number will continue to grow, I think. And many of our downtowns, after years of neglect and disinvestment, are starting to grow again. I think it's a very exciting time for thinking about and working in cities.
I think you've seen some of those changes during the times of your own work, and I wonder if there's anything that you kind of attribute that to, that you think has kind of driven that change in any way.
I think that, for one thing, people have started to see the disadvantages of what my friend Chuck Marone calls the Great Suburban Experiment, where until the last 50 or 60 years, we didn't spread out in such an aggressive and automobile-dependent way that we have in these last several decades. And although maybe in the 1970s, 1980s, that was seen as a mostly good thing, and there was a certain excitement around the suburban lifestyle, I think now people are starting to see that there's some issues that come with that, including, traffic and problems of being able to connect with their neighbors and with the rest of their regions, and as people have seen more of the downside, I guess, of exurban and suburban living, they've taken another look at cities. And I also think it, in kind of a perverse way, maybe it helped that when cities became so disinvested in those latter decades of the 20th century, they also became more affordable. And I think that enabled, some people to try them out that maybe, were not as well equipped to do so at other times.
Well, I'm kind of intrigued listening to that. I think I'm hearing this idea that cities, we're recognizing that they offer things that weren't necessarily available in that suburban setting. And I think that's absolutely something that I think my wife and I can speak to. But I also wonder how this kind of plays out in terms of how different people prioritize different things. I think that, you and I are, as people who have backgrounds in environmental things, see some of the green benefits of density, whereas other folks think of some of the benefits of smart growth being in the transportation side of things, or being in the access to culture side of things. There's just many different reasons to do that. And I wonder how you kind of, there's a natural marriage, but how do you kind of make those things and those groups that are pulled together by disparate forces work together once they're in the same place?
Well, I think, sometimes there are healthy tensions as we tend to sort some of these issues out. and not everybody has the same perspective on a developing urban neighborhood, for example. But I think dialogue around those issues is a healthy thing to have. And I think that because the benefits of urban living are as significant as they are, that I think the trend is going to continue. And I think that we're going to we're going to have some challenges, but I also think that we're going to have a lot of successes as we go about this great return to cities. In fact, in some places we're having so much success that now, instead of disinvestment, we have problems of unaffordability, which is a nicer problem to have, frankly, than disinvestment. But it's nonetheless a problem, and it's one that we need to work through and make sure that the changes that are taking place in cities are the kinds of changes that can benefit all different groups of people and not just benefit newcomers, for instance, to cities. So that's the kind of an example of some of the challenges that we need to work through, but I think it's healthy to work through them, and I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, having seen where cities used to be, I came to Washington to attend law school and moved here in 1969, which was 1 year after the city had riots and burned down major portions of 3 of its streets, and it was a pretty dispiriting place at the time. And now it's just, so much the other way that it's almost too easy to forget where we've come from. But I'm very much optimistic about the sort of arc of the future in our cities, and not just our big cities, our smaller cities as well.
I'm intrigued now. That was one of the questions I was wondering about. Is how do we include smaller cities or even towns in that kind of conversation in terms of how can they lead on some of these issues, and how do they find the same vibrancy that we see in some of the bigger cities these days?
Well, I think I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on Roanoke. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and Asheville went through its down periods. It has an interesting history of periods of success and periods of failure, really over a century and a half at least, and now it's having a great period of success. But that wasn't the case when I was growing up there. But it's brought that success by capitalizing on its assets. It's fortunate enough to be in the middle of a lot of natural beauty with the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains, and it has always had some nice older neighborhoods. And one of the interesting things about Asheville's downtown, for a small city, its downtown is remained largely intact, because when other cities were tearing down their buildings in downtown, the economy was so bad in Asheville that nobody could afford to do that. And so the building sort of sat there until the time came and sensibilities changed in favor of historic preservation. And so when the pendulum finally swung the other way, the wonderful buildings were still there and could be, put to newer uses. I think it's for smaller towns than Asheville and Roanoke, it can be an even bigger challenge in some ways. But I think that some of those are also starting to see entrepreneurs move in and create studios to do their work. And it's not an area that I'm as familiar with as I am with larger cities, but I know for instance, you had Kennedy Smith as a guest not too long ago in your program. Of course, she worked for many years for the National Main Street program. And the Main Street program has done wonders in some smaller cities at reviving their commercial districts and making them places that people want to be again. I think of Corning, New York, as an example. I think it only has 11 or 12,000 people, but it's got this really exciting Main Street, and it's a place where you want to be, and it makes you, because it's a small town, everybody can walk there. It makes you think that, okay, there's something to this. There's a market for this. There's a market for bigger cities. There's a market for medium-sized cities. But maybe there's a market for some of these smaller towns too.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. I wonder, as we talk about these things, that I think about Asheville, I think about D.C., and I think that it's interesting to kind of mark those rises and falls, and I wonder what your thoughts are on kind of the role of government in that. And I think when I look at Asheville, I certainly see a lot of private enterprise that's driving things, but I have to imagine that there are often also government foundations that some of that is laid on. And in D.C. area, I think about the trolley on 8th Street in Northeast, which I used to live near, but that totally changed that neighborhood. But it's a mix of that private and government. And I would just wonder if you could talk a bit about where you think those roles mix and how they should work together.
That's a great question. I think that government needs to be in a position that allows private enterprise to prosper and do good things, and that rewards them when they do. And as we're talking right now, the Congress has tax reform legislation before it that would weaken some of those incentives for building affordable housing, for adapting and reusing historic properties. And so I'm very concerned that the role of the government is maybe changing from one of being a helpful partner to partner that's not so helpful. And I think that it sort of remains to be seen who's going to fill those gaps. I mean, there are some great private foundations, as you mentioned, but there's a limit to how much capacity and funding can be spread around and applied to these places. I'm still optimistic, though. I mean, I think that the role of government can be helpful, and also think that local government can be helpful in ways that maybe the federal government either cannot be helpful or doesn't want to be helpful anymore. But that's one of the things that the firm that I help, Placemakers, does, is we help communities establish a planning and zoning framework that makes it easy for, or easier for developers and entrepreneurs to build the kinds of places that are walkable, that are green, that are welcoming to people. A lot of our zoning laws were last updated many, many decades ago and are out of date now, and really need to be brought up to date so that they can function in the 21st century with the kinds of values, particularly for walkability, that people have now.
Well, it's always interesting to me how those things that many of us don't think about at all, such as zoning, play such a large role in these conversations.
Well, I think it does. It sets the rules, and in a lot of places, because of outdated zoning laws, the kinds of really good progressive development that we would love and that people would love are not allowed today because under the old zoning laws, so that people have to, or entrepreneurs and developers have to go to the trouble to seek a variance to get their projects approved in spite of the zoning laws, and climb over some hurdles that really shouldn't be there. So if zoning is wrong, it can really hurt a lot, and if it's right, it can really help a lot.
It's always interesting, as someone who lives in Virginia, which is a very strong Dillons Rule state. The fact that that is a big deal is lost on most people, but it's also inhibits us from doing many of the interesting things that we could do were we given a little more freedom. And it's one of those things that will forever probably change things if we can do anything about it, but most people don't even know to talk about it.
Yeah, this is very esoteric stuff, and but even so, more people are talking about it now than were before. The planning profession has been energized over the last couple of decades, along with the environmental world, and I think a lot of these concepts are now taught in planning schools and shared at conferences, and I'm going to keep my optimism on that. I think that although it's going to happen in some places more quickly than others, and it's going to be a challenge in some places, I think that it's going to continue to nudge along in the right direction.
Well, I must say I'm glad to hear your optimism. I must say it's hard for me to maintain mine much of the time. Part of that. So just to share a little bit of my backstory, I worked with some folks at Virginia Tech and did a master's in forestry of all things. I don't know anything about trees, so please don't ever ask me anything about trees. But focused on sustainable development adoption, and the big thing was that the Tea Party at that time was very opposed to sustainable development for a number of reasons that are not necessary to bring up right now. But I wonder kind of how you think we go about creating shared vision in a place where everything seems increasingly politicized, and it's hard to have even basic conversations about terms without those becoming battlegrounds in some ways.
That's a very significant question. And I think that your vocabulary points us in the right direction when you said shared vision. I think that it's really important that the vision be shared. And although people are passionate about political points of view, some of which may be opposed to the idea of planning, once you get past that idea, the idea, you can have a conversation about, how far they have to go to get their kids to school, and it's a different conversation than when you're talking about ideology. And if you can somehow make the conversation about real things and what people would like to see for their communities, including people that you and I might disagree with, I think it's possible to find common ground here and there. It takes some skill among the part of good facilitators to help with those conversations, and at some point it takes some goodwill on the part of many people, the local government, the smart growth advocates, the more conservative viewpoints do have to find some goodwill together. But I've seen it happen, and I think that, like here in Washington, it's pretty interesting. In my neighborhood, we don't have an active Tea Party component here, but we do have people who have been in the past very concerned and opposed to neighborhood change, even in places where neighborhood change is exactly what we need, because the buildings are outmoded and they don't take advantage of transit the way that they could, and we need more, more of the right kind of development. And over the past 15 or 20 years, I've seen the conversation change from one in which it was whether we should have a particular development or not to what kind of development we should have. And that's a better conversation to have. Another thing that I think, and I feel this pretty strongly, is that nature is something that can bring us together. We, in smart growth and efficient transportation movements or communities, believe in density, as we should, because the research backs us up on that, and shows that environmental problems and emissions are reduced when we have the right kind of city density. But I think it's important that that density come along with beauty
Mm.
and with nature that can soften that density and make it more appealing. And so I think we need to give more thought to how we can do both of those things at the same time, how we can promote development and promote the introduction of nature into our neighborhoods. Green infrastructure is one good way of doing that. The same sorts of techniques that can help us manage stormwater in our streets can also bring really attractive landscaping into our neighborhoods. And if we think more creatively about ways in which we can have urban intensity, but within reason, and accompanied by urban beauty, I think it helps. So you asked at the beginning of our conversation how I saw my role in this larger movement, and one of the ways I see my role is as an advocate for city nature. And I think there's some places that are doing well at that, and there's some places that aren't thinking about it at all. And I think that it would help if they did.
Fascinating. I really like that, and I wonder if you could speak to the fact that a lot of times the benefits from that are not as tangible as some of the other things that we could perhaps spend money on, and so it often gets overlooked. But that really, when you make this a priority, the outcomes really are there to be seen, even if not in such a tangible way as X amount of output.
The public health benefits are very real, and I think people need to think of nature as a sort of part of health infrastructure, among other things. I tend to follow the literature with respect to nature and health, and it's just getting more and more robust. I have a hard time keeping up for good reason, because there's so much of it. But when we're in urban nature, our blood pressure goes down, our mental acuity goes up. I like to say those are two reasons I need to spend more time there. And the latest research that I've seen shows that people who live near urban nature actually live longer than people who don't. So there's a strong health argument that's backed up by a lot of science for it.
It's intriguing as well, because I think that we've seen that there's as there are with most things, there's an equity component to this as well, in terms of the well-to-do neighborhoods often have enough of that natural component, and so they get to benefit from all of that in addition to the other advantages they have, whereas those communities that struggle with many things often struggle with that natural outlet as well.
Yeah, and there's research that demonstrates that, unfortunately. I had the honor of working in a low-income neighborhood in Boston a few years ago, and one of the things that they did, there were two interesting things that they did that were related. One is that there was a faith-based community in the neighborhood that really saw its mission in a very Christian sense, saw its mission as taking care of the neighborhood, and that included taking care of the physical neighborhood as well as the people in it. And they actually produced a green space plan for this low-income neighborhood in Boston. And one of the elements of that plan that was realized was to take a couple of abandoned, vacant lots. This was a neighborhood that had seen a lot of disinvestment, so there were some vacancies. And these two lots were adjacent to each other. And they came up with the idea to lobby the city to convert them into a children's park. And, you know, it took some time. It took a little help from some conservation organizations, including the Trust for Public Land. But eventually they succeeded. It's not very big. And when I think about urban nature, I don't necessarily think about big parks. I like little parks that can be tucked into neighborhoods. This is less than half an acre, but it's such a great asset to its community, and it shows one of the ways in which we can bring more of these benefits into the neediest of our communities.
Do you also find that when you are able to connect people with nature, that in many ways that can lead to a better understanding of the interconnectedness of everything that they see around them, and kind of break down the individualism that we see in many places?
I do, because first I was going to say we all love nature. Maybe there's some people who don't, but you know, most of us do. And it's a shared value. And it's one that even folks who might disagree on some other things would tend to agree on. And that gets you into conversations. Well, you know, if we want a new park, in order to get somebody to pay for it, we may need to bring in a little bit more development. Can we bring in a certain amount of development in order to have this new pocket park or this new children's park or whatever it is? And then the conversation becomes, well, yeah, maybe we can do that. So what kind of development would enable that? And how much do we need, and you know, and how much do we not need, you know, to accomplish that? And you can have a creative conversation where people are thinking and working together.
Well, I'm going to guess that this next question that you're going to say green space is a large part of it, but I wonder, when you who have traveled and consulted and done work all over the country, when you go to a new community or to a new place and you're looking around, what are kind of the components that you see that let you know that this place is doing well or thriving in some way?
You know, I like to say that there are indicator species for people habitat. You know, when I titled my book People Habitat, I had a couple things in mind, and one was that people need to be a big part of our focus, because, as I said earlier, if our solutions don't work for people, then they're not going to work for the environment. But also, I tend to think of habitat as something that applies not only to natural habitat, but that also applies to the built environment that we create for people. And our homes, our shops, our workplaces, our neighborhoods, our cities and towns all need to be healthy and fit together in a healthy and harmonious way in order for the people habitat ecosystem to be healthy. And I like to say that just as we have indicator species for natural habitat, if we're studying a river, we may look to a particular species of fish to determine whether that river is ecologically healthy. When it comes to people habitat, kids and elders make great indicator species. And if a place works for kids and it works for elders, and chances are it works for everybody. And so if I see kids and elders out on the street and enjoying each other and enjoying their community, then that gives me a pretty good feeling about the community.
Well, I can't say enough how much I love that perspective. My wife and I have a 3 month old, and it's changing everything, and it's that resonates a lot with me to see that.
Oh, congratulations! That's an exciting time.
Thank you, thank
How's
you.
your sleep coming along?
Knock on wood, we're doing okay at the moment. Well, I wonder, as you've done this work over the years and been involved in the environmental side, and then moved to see, this city side as well. What kind of have you learned along the way that maybe you didn't expect that you would be thinking at this point?
I think I've learned that, well, two things. One is that not everybody thinks the way I do. so I've learned that some people don't care about my environmental arguments, and so that I have to reach them in other ways. And maybe a more positive thing that I've learned is that people care a great deal about their communities. And everybody is interested, and they may not come to the public meeting with the same perspective, but they all have something to bring. And I have learned that a lot of these viewpoints are valuable, and that it is every bit as important that we listen as it is that we try to educate. We have a lot to learn, and if we're lucky and good at what we do, we never stop learning. And I have spent time with all sorts of people that I didn't necessarily think I would be spending time with, that have taught me a lot, and that mostly have taught me that they care about their communities in a very sincere and earnest way. And that's another thing that gives me hope.
Do you think that in that act of seeking out other voices to hear and learning from others and really listening to others, that you're growing a sense of humility that's kind of vital for this process as well?
Hugely. I think that it's so important that we be humble. And a lot of people who work for causes, including people who work for environmental causes, are not necessarily known for their humility, and we should be. That's something that we should learn, and that we should practice and live by. One of the partners in my firm often refers to her husband, who says that many problems in the world could be solved through a combination of compassion and humility. And to me, those are pretty powerful words, and pretty important words. If we don't have compassion, and if we don't have humility, then what are we as people? Because this is not just about how we construct our communities in a physical sense. It's also about who we are as people, and what kind of lives we lead, for those of us who are practitioners in this world. And I have a feeling that if I don't learn how to be good at compassion and humility, then chances are a lot of the other stuff doesn't matter so much.
Well, that's such a powerful perspective, and I think for those of us that get caught up in the work, it can be easy to forget sometimes that communities are really at their base level just a collection of people, and that's what needs to be kept in mind in many ways.
Yeah, I think so. And it's really exciting when people do come together around something, and you sort of see it happen. Where people start out with different perspectives, and suddenly light bulb goes off in one part of the room, and then somebody in another part of the room gets it, and suddenly we're talking about the same thing instead of talking about different things. And when it happens, it's a pretty wonderful thing. I've had the privilege of working in a number of low-income communities, and I've seen that. And somebody who doesn't have compassion and humility might well think that low-income residents aren't, equipped by education or training or experience to don't have the tools to shape their community, but they do, and they care a lot, and they're honestly some of the nicest people I've met, and it's I've really been lucky to have been able to do some of my work in those kinds of communities.
I kind of hate to bring us to a close, but I wonder if you could, in closing, share a story of a time when a community worked well and what that kind of looked like, or how a story of how a community can work well.
Well, I worked in a place in Boston. It's the same place that managed to lobby the city into converting a couple of vacant lots into a children's park. And I watched them talk the first night about crime and distress and disinvestment and a little worry about changes that were going to come to their community. And by the end of our time together, they were talking in a very positive sense about their community, and we were able to secure some foundation support for them to do some pretty serious work retrofitting their buildings for energy efficiency, which is a more tangible thing, but one that was really important, not just to the environment, but because it lowered their energy bills. And that was a result. And then another result was to see a new vision for a street in the community that had been terribly run down. It was an old industrial street where the industry had long been abandoned and was now a place where nobody would really want to go if they didn't have to. And by the end of it, we were talking about green infrastructure and new affordable housing on the street and all sorts of wonderful things. Another thing I learned about that neighborhood, I mentioned the faith-based organization that had done good work in the neighborhood. Another was a guy named Larry. I can't remember Larry's last name, but he ran an auto body shop that was in the neighborhood. And a lot of us might think that we wouldn't want to live next to an auto body shop. But if it's Larry's, you would. And the reason is because he was the leader of the green business community. He was powering his shop with solar panels, putting a green roof on top, and was really the most progressive businessman in the community, and was bringing a lot of wisdom and resources to bear that helped everybody. So that was a real eye opener to me, and somebody I just loved having a brief encounter with for several days. I think that in this line of work we do get frustrated from time to time, but when we meet great people and are able to see good outcomes, it can be extremely satisfying. And I do believe, to go back to my optimism, that because of the changes I've seen in cities and in neighborhoods over the last 20, 30 years, that we live in a time where that optimism is warranted, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, that's such a great message to kind of to wrap up on there. And Kate, I wonder if you could tell us, are those listening, if they have an interest in learning more about your work or what you're doing, where they might be able to find more information?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter. I tweet a lot, and it's at Cade _N DC. And I write for Huffington Post from time to time. I haven't written in a while, but you can find me there. And if you would like to learn more about my book, you can go to peoplehabitat.com. And a lot of the things that I'm interested in and talk about are collected in that book, and the website pretty much summarizes what it's all about. So I would welcome people at any of those places.
Well, and if you all are interested in more information about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But thank you so much for taking the time today, Kate. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, Brett. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia, and keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksxpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.